The golden glow of chandeliers bathed the marble floors of one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Every surface sparkled, polished to perfection, and every corner seemed to whisper wealth and privilege. Bellboys in crisp uniforms wheeled. Luggage carts passed guests dressed in designer clothes, their heels clicking sharply against the marble. The receptionist typed briskly behind the front desk, her eyes glued to the computer screen, her perfectly manicured nails tapping with practiced impatience. It was a world where appearances mattered above all, where luxury was currency, and humility often went unnoticed, mistaken for insignificance. And then, without any fanfare or announcement, Manny Pacquiao walked in. There were no bodyguards, no entourage, no flashing cameras. Just a man in a simple polo shirt, faded jeans and worn sneakers carrying a modest travel bag. He moved calmly through the lobby, smiling politely at the few curious glances he received. People whispered among themselves, barely believing someone could enter such a grand space without the usual display of wealth or status. Manny's presence didn't scream celebrity or grandeur. Instead, it radiated something subtler: confidence without arrogance, patience without haste, and humility without self-doubt. The receptionist barely glanced at him, her fingers still tapping the keys as though he were invisible. When she did notice, her eyes flicked over him quickly, from his plain clothes to the small, polite smile tugging at his lips. "Yes?" she asked flatly, as though he were an inconvenience rather than a guest. "I'd like to book a room, please," Manny said calmly, his voice soft yet firm. There was no hesitation, no self-importance, just quiet respect. The receptionist's eyebrow rose slightly, a smirk threatening to form. "We're fully booked," she said, her tone clipped and dismissive. Manny looked around. The lobby wasn't crowded. Guests were checking out, staff moved freely, and other customers were waiting calmly. He nodded politely. Around him, whispers began to ripple through the lobby. A few guests chuckled under their breath, glancing at the ordinary man who dared to request a room here. Two colleagues at the front desk leaned closer to each other, whispering and casting sideways glances at Manny. Curiosity mingled with judgment. Manny didn't react. He didn't argue, didn't frown, didn't raise his voice. He simply waited. His calm presence alone started to shift the atmosphere subtly, making the arrogant murmurs seem louder and the judgmental stares feel a little smaller. Have you ever walked into a place and felt completely invisible? How would you handle it if the world judged you just by how you looked? Comment below. Even in these first few moments, one thing was clear. Everyone in the lobby underestimated him, and they had no idea how wrong they were. "I'd like to book a room, please," Manny Pacquiao repeated calmly, approaching the reception desk with the same polite, unassuming smile. His demeanor was quiet, almost serene, yet it carried an unshakable sense of dignity that drew eyes without demanding attention. The receptionist barely looked up. "We're fully booked," she said flatly, her tone tight and dismissive, as if saying more might require effort she didn't want to give. Her fingers tapped the keyboard and her eyes quickly returned to the screen, ignoring the quiet presence of the man standing just in front of her. Manny glanced around the lobby, and something didn't add up. Guests were checking out, bellboys moved freely, luggage carts rolled past without congestion, and the line at the desk wasn't long. Yet still, she insisted. He nodded politely. "I see. Perhaps you could check again?" His voice remained calm, almost gentle, but there was a weight to it, a subtle challenge that seemed to hang in the air. Behind her, colleagues whispered and exchanged sideways glances. A young male receptionist leaned toward his coworker and murmured just loud enough for Manny to hear, "Maybe he thinks this is a budget inn." He smirked at his own joke, expecting Manny to react, to argue, or to storm out in frustration. But Manny remained calm, standing silently, hands resting lightly on his travel bag. His composure only grew more unsettling to them. A few guests in line noticed the interaction. Some chuckled quietly, assuming they were witnessing a man out of place, a nobody being politely dismissed by those who considered themselves superior. The arrogance in the receptionist's voice was palpable. "Sir," she said sharply, leaning forward, "We have no rooms. You might want to try another hotel, something more within your range." Manny didn't flinch. He simply observed, his eyes steady, taking in every detail. The whispers, the smirks, the rolling of the eyes, the laughter under breath. To anyone else, such dismissal might spark irritation, anger, or humiliation. But Manny remained composed, patient and unbothered, letting the weight of his silence speak louder than words could. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped aside, allowing the couple behind him to check in. He moved to a nearby leather chair, gently placing his travel bag on the floor. He sat with a posture that was neither defensive nor slouched, simply calm, quiet, and observant. The atmosphere in the lobby began to shift subtly. His refusal to escalate, his refusal to argue, made the onlookers uncomfortable. The guests, who had once whispered and laughed, now exchanged curious glances. Why wasn't he leaving? Why hadn't he reacted angrily? The receptionist, frustrated that he had not left, tried once more. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "as I said, there's nothing we can do for you here. You're welcome to wait, but it won't change anything." Her words floated across the lobby, drawing more attention. Whispers spread like a ripple through water. Guests began noticing details they hadn't before. The calm determination in Manny's posture, the patience that made their own impatience seem small. Even the junior bellboy who had been carrying luggage slowed as he passed Manny. A glance full of sympathy and respect was exchanged, almost unnoticed by the senior staff. Manny's stillness had begun to unsettle the arrogant energy of the room. For the first time, those mocking him realized their behavior was being silently observed, catalogued, and they could feel the subtle weight of accountability pressing down even if they couldn't yet articulate it. What would you do in Manny's place? Would you argue, storm out, or remain calm and watch? Comment below. We want to know your strategy. And then Manny did something even more disarming. He reached into his travel bag, pulled out a small notebook, and began jotting notes quietly. He didn't look angry, frustrated, or defeated. He looked thoughtful, reflective, almost as if he were documenting not just the scene in front of him, but the character of the people who assumed they held all the power. The staff's arrogance, the guests' judgments, and the receptionist's dismissive attitude were all silently recorded in his calm observation. In less than 10 minutes, the lobby had transformed. What started as a simple request for a room was now a quiet spectacle, a test of patience, humility, and integrity. Those who thought they held authority realized something strange. This ordinary man was quietly commanding the room with nothing but his presence, his calm, and his dignity. They had underestimated him. They didn't know who he was, yet. And very soon, they would regret it. Manny Pacquiao didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he moved with a quiet dignity that seemed almost unnatural in a lobby dominated by arrogance and entitlement. He stepped aside, allowing a well-dressed couple behind him to check in without hesitation. Then, without a word, he walked toward a leather chair in the corner of the lobby, placed his modest travel bag on the floor, and sat down. His posture was upright but relaxed, commanding attention without demanding it. Guests who had been whispering and snickering suddenly found themselves drawn in by his calm presence. Something about the way he sat, notebook in hand, jotting down small notes quietly, was magnetic. It wasn't arrogance or pride, it was patience, observation, and self-control. Even the receptionist, who had been so quick to dismiss him, began to feel a subtle shift in the air, though she didn't yet understand why. A young bellboy, Daniel, slowed his pace as he passed by Manny. The boy had been working long shifts, carrying bags heavier than himself, running errands for demanding guests and rarely receiving acknowledgement. Daniel's eyes met Manny's briefly, and for a moment, a silent understanding passed between them. There was no fanfare, no spoken words, just recognition of effort and dignity. Daniel gave a small, almost apologetic nod before continuing with his duties, but the gesture did not go unnoticed by the sharp eyes of the receptionist. The receptionist's irritation grew with each passing minute. Manny hadn't left. He hadn't protested. He wasn't pleading. He was simply present, patient, calm, and unshakable. Around him, whispers spread among guests. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing the man they had laughed at was demonstrating a composure far beyond their own. Others watched curiously, wondering who he really was and why no one else seemed to notice his quiet authority. The bellboys and junior staff noticed something even more remarkable. Here was someone who didn't judge based on appearance or status. Here was someone who observed, listened, and respected without demanding anything in return. For them, it was both inspiring and unsettling. They had grown accustomed to the hierarchy of the hotel, the strict rules, the silent oppression, the dismissive glances, and yet Manny's presence disrupted it effortlessly. Manny opened his small notebook and began jotting down notes, his movements slow, deliberate, and thoughtful. He wasn't just observing the staff. He was quietly documenting the arrogance, prejudice, and dismissiveness he had encountered. Every eye roll, every whisper, every small act of condescension was noted, though no one would ever see these pages. It was as if he were collecting proof, not to punish but to reveal the truth at the right moment. The lobby seemed to shift around him. The constant hum of conversations and the clatter of luggage wheels faded into the background. Even the chandeliers, golden and imposing, could not command attention the way Manny's quiet patience did. Guests who had been ready to dismiss him began to feel a subtle sense of unease. Why hadn't he argued? Why hadn't he left? His calm defiance spoke louder than shouts ever could. For the first time, the staff who had mocked him began to see that their behavior said more about them than it did about him. Their arrogance, their judgment, their assumptions, they were all on display, silently recorded by a man they had underestimated. The tension in the lobby grew heavier with each passing second. Every small gesture by Manny, from a tilt of the head to a soft glance, seemed to carry weight, forcing those around him to reconsider their own actions. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's calmness exposed the arrogance of others? What would you do in Manny's place, argue or observe? Minutes passed. The lobby continued its usual flow, guests arriving and leaving, bellboys moving luggage, but the energy had changed. What had begun as a simple request for a room had transformed into a silent spectacle. People were watching, waiting, and wondering. Manny wasn't trying to prove anything yet, but his presence alone was a quiet challenge to the assumptions, biases, and pride around him. He hadn't said a word of anger. He hadn't revealed who he was. But very soon the lobby would witness a truth so undeniable that no arrogance could survive it. After several minutes of silent observation, Manny Pacquiao rose from his chair and walked calmly back toward the front desk. The receptionist straightened in her seat, visibly irritated. "Yes?" she said sharply, as though his mere return was a personal affront. Manny smiled gently. "I was wondering if you could check one more time," he said softly, his tone polite but carrying subtle authority. "Sometimes a little effort can make a big difference for someone who needs help." The receptionist's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Sir, I already told you we're full," she snapped. "There's nothing here for you." Her voice carried across the lobby, drawing curious glances from guests. Manny tilted his head slightly. His gaze was calm, measured, and direct. "Tell me," he asked gently, "do you treat all your guests this way or only those who don't look the part?" The words hung in the air like a weight, heavier than the chandeliers above. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering to each other, while others nodded subtly in agreement. Some even bit their lips, realizing they had been complicit in similar judgments in their own lives. The receptionist blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time, though she quickly masked it with a shallow glare. Manny continued, voice soft but deliberate. "Not everyone who walks through these doors wears expensive clothes, but every person who enters deserves respect. Don't you agree?" A few whispers of acknowledgement spread through the lobby. A businesswoman in pearls murmured to her companion, "He makes a good point." The receptionist stiffened, clearly feeling cornered. "Sir, I don't need a lecture," she said, attempting to regain control. "This is a 5-star hotel. We can't just treat people like they don't matter." Manny leaned slightly forward, his voice still calm but carrying unmistakable weight. "Standards?" he asked quietly, almost rhetorically. "Are standards only measured by clothing and wallets?" The young male receptionist who had smirked earlier faltered, his smirk fading under Manny's steady gaze. Guests, who had once been passive onlookers, now leaned in. Some were nodding subtly. Others were visibly embarrassed at the realization of their own judgments. Then Manny asked the question that made the air in the lobby almost vibrate. "What would you do if someone walked in here who was truly in need? Someone tired, hungry, maybe not dressed their best? Would you turn them away too?" The receptionist's face hardened, but her voice wavered slightly. "That's not my problem. My job is to maintain the standards of this hotel. People who can't afford it shouldn't even try." Manny paused, letting her words linger in the silence. Then he leaned forward just a fraction, his eyes softening, his tone inviting reflection. "And what if one day you were in that position yourself? What if you lost everything and needed someone to treat you with dignity? Would you still judge based on appearance?" The lobby fell quieter. Even the sound of luggage wheels rolling across marble seemed to fade into the background. Guests, staff, and even the receptionist felt the weight of the question. For the first time, the arrogance that had dominated the room felt small and fragile. Finally, Manny took a step back and returned to his chair, still calm, still patient. But the change in the room was unmistakable. His questions had pierced the facade of authority, exposing the assumptions, prejudice, and condescension that had gone unnoticed, or ignored, by almost everyone. A junior bellboy, Daniel, who had shown a subtle glance of sympathy earlier, paused in his work. He noticed Manny's quiet method of confrontation and the way it commanded respect without shouting or anger. There was a lesson here, one not about rules or money or luxury, but about dignity, fairness, and empathy. Minutes passed, yet the tension remained. Manny's calm presence and pointed questions were slowly turning a lobby full of judgmental whispers into a room of reflection. The arrogance of some staff was now tempered by self-consciousness, while guests were quietly realizing they had been part of the very prejudice Manny was highlighting. The receptionist thought she had all the control, but Manny hadn't revealed who he truly was yet, and when she finds out, the impact will be unforgettable. After a few more minutes of tense silence, a young bellboy named Daniel quietly approached Manny. His steps were hesitant, almost nervous, clutching the handle of a luggage cart as if it were a shield. He had been watching the interaction from a distance, aware of the receptionist's disdain and the judgmental glances of some guests. He had learned long ago that in this lobby, humility and hard work were often invisible. "Sir," Daniel said softly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the front desk. I'm sorry about how they treated you. Not everyone here is like that." Manny looked up, his calm eyes meeting Daniel's. He offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Daniel. Tell me, do they always treat guests this way?" Daniel swallowed, hard. "Not always. Only when they think someone doesn't belong," he admitted. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of years of unnoticed effort. Manny's gaze softened, and he leaned slightly closer, inviting Daniel to share more. "And you?" Manny asked gently. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, Daniel replied, his shoulders stiffening as the memory surfaced. "I started when I was 19. My mom got sick and I had to quit school to help pay for her medicine. This job, it's the only thing I could find." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, revealing the exhaustion and responsibility he carried daily. Manny nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "That must be hard, carrying so much responsibility at such a young age," he said softly. Daniel's throat tightened, but he continued. "Some days I work double shifts," Daniel admitted, "carry bags heavier than me, run errands for the guests, and still get scolded if I'm too slow. The manager says we should always smile, no matter what, but sometimes it's hard to smile when you go home and realize you can't even pay the full rent." Manny listened carefully, absorbing every word. "You're doing your best, Daniel," he said quietly. "And that matters. More than anything they see. More than the chandeliers, more than the polished floors and brass railings. The bellboy blinked, surprised at the compassion in Manny's voice. Few guests, and certainly no management, had ever asked about his struggles or truly listened. For the first time, someone saw him, not as a worker to be dismissed, but as a person with dignity, responsibility, and heart. Manny leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if speaking directly to Daniel's heart. "Do the others here know your story?" Daniel shook his head. "They don't care. To them, I'm just invisible. Sometimes they laugh at me, say I'll never amount to anything. Even the receptionist once said, 'People like you should be grateful just to breathe the same air as the guests.'" Manny's gaze sharpened briefly, then softened. "And how did that make you feel?" he asked gently. I felt small," Daniel admitted, a faint smile appearing despite the weight of years of dismissal. "But I try not to show it. I just keep going because if I stop, my family has nothing." The lobby seemed to fade away for a moment. The sparkling marble floors, the gleaming chandeliers, and the murmurs of guests all became background noise to the raw honesty between Manny and Daniel. Manny's calm presence and attentive listening made the boy feel valued for the first time in years. "Daniel," Manny said finally, his tone steady and sincere, "you are not invisible. Your struggle, your sacrifice, they mean more than this hotel's luxury. Because you carry something priceless, love for your family, responsibility, and integrity. That is worth more than any marble floor or gold-plated chandelier." Daniel's eyes widened, tears welling but refusing to fall. No one had ever spoken to him this way, not his managers, not the guests, not even himself. Yet here was Manny Pacquiao, a man whose achievements spanned the world, acknowledging his worth and the dignity in his hard work. Nearby, a few guests had overheard parts of the conversation. Their laughter and judgment from earlier were replaced by thoughtful silence. A woman in pearls bit her lip, recalling how she had dismissed a hotel worker just a day before. The receptionist, meanwhile, fidgeted with her computer screen, unable to mask the trembling of her hands. Manny's questions and Daniel's honesty had pierced the bubble of arrogance and pretense that had dominated the lobby. Manny wasn't finished yet. He knew there was more to uncover, not just about Daniel, but about the culture that allowed such injustice to go unnoticed. He leaned back slightly, keeping his eyes on the young bellboy. "Daniel, if I were to ask others here, about you, what would they say?" Daniel hesitated. "They'd probably call me clumsy or slow. Some laugh at me when I trip over the luggage carts. They don't see I'm always running on little sleep." Manny nodded. "Let's find out," he said calmly, standing and walking toward a small group of staff gathered nearby. The receptionist's face flushed with annoyance. "Sir," she said, trying to assert control, "there's no point in disturbing the staff. We're full. This is inappropriate." Manny ignored her, approaching a housekeeper arranging flowers near the elevator. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Do you know Daniel?" The housekeeper froze, surprised by the question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice low. "He's one of the hardest workers here. Sometimes I see him sleeping in the storage room during breaks because he can't afford to go home." Manny's expression softened. "And yet they treat him like dirt?" The housekeeper nodded. Another staff member, an older porter, joined the conversation. "That kid has more heart than anyone in this building," he said gruffly. "He gives away half his lunch to new trainees who don't have food. But the managers, they only see a boy in a worn uniform." Nearby guests leaned closer, some even setting down their drinks, absorbing the truth. Even a well-dressed businessman added his voice. "I've stayed here for years. That boy once carried 6 of my suitcases up 3 flights of stairs when the elevator broke. He refused a tip, saying, 'Sir, you've already paid for the service.' I've never seen honesty like that anywhere else." Manny turned back to the receptionist, his tone calm but firm. "It seems Daniel is more than what you painted him to be." Her jaw clenched, her arrogance finally cracking under the weight of undeniable truth. What Manny does next will not only honor Daniel but shake the entire hotel to its core. The lobby had grown quieter. the murmurs fading as the weight of Daniel's story settled over everyone. Guests and staff alike had begun to realize the disparity between appearance and character, but the tension had yet to reach its peak. Manny Pacquiao, calm and unassuming, stood and approached the front desk again. This time, he carried not just quiet authority, but the undeniable presence of truth. The receptionist straightened in her seat, her face flushed. "Sir," she said sharply, attempting to regain control. "Please, this is highly inappropriate. You're causing a scene." Manny's gaze swept over the room, taking in the staff, the guests, and Daniel, standing quietly nearby. His tone was soft, yet every word carried the weight of undeniable authority. "What's inappropriate," he began slowly, "is mocking the very people who keep this hotel running. What's inappropriate is judging someone's worth by how they look or what they wear." Guests who had been leaning in, curious, now leaned even closer, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. A hush fell over the lobby. Even the faint clatter of luggage carts seemed to pause as Manny continued, his voice measured but firm. "Respect," he said, emphasizing the word, "is not a luxury reserved for those who can afford a suite. It is the minimum that every human being deserves. Daniel here," he gestured toward the young bellboy, "has worked tirelessly through hardship, exhaustion, and humiliation. Not for himself, but for his family. And yet, he has been treated as if he were invisible." The receptionist's hands trembled slightly, her arrogance beginning to crumble under the undeniable truth of Manny's words. Guests exchanged guilty looks, some nodded quietly, recognizing their own complicity in the judgment they had passed. Even the junior staff avoided eye contact, embarrassed by the harsh reality that Manny had exposed. Manny stepped closer to the desk, his voice unwavering. "This hotel prides itself on luxury," he said. "But true luxury is not chandeliers, silk drapes, or marble floors. True luxury is treating every human being with kindness, dignity, and respect. Without it, all the gold in this lobby is meaningless." He paused, letting the words sink in. The air was thick with reflection, and even the most arrogant staff members were forced to confront the reality of their behavior. Guests who had once laughed quietly at Daniel now looked at him with admiration, their earlier judgment replaced by shame and understanding. Then Manny addressed the receptionist directly. "You didn't see a guest," he said gently but firmly. "You saw someone you believed was beneath you, and that is unacceptable." Her eyes dropped, shame replacing the smugness she had worn so confidently. The staff around her shifted uncomfortably. The lobby, once a place of whispers and arrogance, now felt like a stage where truth had spoken louder than power. Manny turned toward Daniel, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You carry more dignity in your worn-out shoes than this entire hotel carries in its polished walls," he said. "Your hard work, your sacrifice, your kindness, they are more valuable than any luxury this place can offer." Daniel's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill. For the first time, he felt seen, not just as a worker, but as a person whose efforts and integrity mattered. The guests who had overheard the exchange now clapped softly, not for Manny, but for the recognition of something they had overlooked for far too long. Manny wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Hanging up, he smiled. "As of this moment," he announced, his voice carrying across the lobby, "I will personally ensure that Daniel's mother receives the medical care she needs. And Daniel, if you're willing, I'd like to sponsor your education so you can finish what you started." The lobby erupted, genuine applause filling the room. Guests clapped, some standing, moved not by celebrity, but by the integrity and compassion Manny had shown. Daniel's knees nearly buckled, his hand flying to his mouth as tears welled in his eyes. The boy who had once felt invisible now stood at the center of admiration and hope. The receptionist sank into her chair, humbled and silent, her arrogance stripped bare by truth and kindness. She had nothing left to defend. Manny gave Daniel a reassuring nod. "Your story is not over," he whispered. "Today is just the beginning." For a moment, the lobby was completely still, the air heavy with reflection and awe. The golden chandeliers seemed to shine differently now, not as symbols of wealth, but as witnesses to the power of humility, dignity, and respect. Have you ever seen someone rise not through force but through patience and empathy? What would you do if you were in this lobby? Comment below. We want to hear your perspective. Manny's final words will leave the hotel forever changed, but his lessons go far beyond this room. Manny Pacquiao stood near the exit of the hotel lobby, his presence commanding yet calm, as the room absorbed the weight of what had just occurred. The staff who had once dismissed Daniel now stared at him in silent reflection, while the guests watched quietly, many still processing the shift in energy. The hotel, which had once thrived on appearances and prestige, was now suspended in an atmosphere heavy with accountability and awareness. Daniel, still trembling, looked up at Manny. Tears streaked his cheeks, but his chin lifted in a new kind of pride. For years he had carried the weight of invisibility, the silent judgment of those who failed to see him as more than a uniformed worker. Now, in just a few minutes, that burden had been lifted, not by force, but by someone who saw him, truly saw him and acknowledged his worth. Manny turned back to the crowd one last time. "Remember this," he said, his voice soft but resonant, filling every corner of the lobby. "The greatest victories aren't measured by titles, money, or fame. They are measured by how we treat others, especially those who seem smaller than us. Because one day it might be their kindness, their integrity, or their courage that changes everything for us." A hush fell over the room. Even the receptionist, her head bowed in shame, felt the sting of truth in his words. The junior staff looked on, inspired and thoughtful, while guests whispered among themselves, reflecting on their own judgments and behavior. Then Manny turned to Daniel again, placing both hands gently on the young man's shoulders. "This is your moment," he said quietly. "Stand tall. You've endured, you've worked hard, and you've carried more responsibility than most can imagine. From now on, people will see you differently, but never forget that true strength comes from humility, patience, and kindness." Daniel nodded, tears still glistening, but now mingled with pride and determination. His posture straightened, his small frame imbued with a new confidence. He had been seen, respected, and valued for who he truly was, not for appearances, wealth, or status. Manny picked up his bag and began walking toward the exit. The crowd instinctively parted, a collective recognition of his presence and influence. As he reached the doors, he paused slightly and looked back, offering a final piece of wisdom. Titles, uniforms, bank accounts, they do not define a person's worth. Respect, dignity, and kindness are the true measures of greatness. Treat everyone with care, even when no one is watching. That is the legacy we leave behind. With that, he stepped out, leaving a lobby forever changed. The once arrogant staff were now introspective. Guests were quietly reevaluating their own judgments. And Daniel, once invisible, now stood in the center of attention, empowered and celebrated. The hotel seemed to breathe differently. The marble, floors and chandeliers remained the same, yet their significance had shifted. They were no longer symbols of superficial luxury. They were now a silent backdrop to a lesson in humanity, humility, and empathy that would linger far longer than the shimmer of gold or crystal. Nearby, the porter and housekeeper exchanged glances inspired by Manny's actions. Even the guests who had once laughed at Daniel now approached him with words of encouragement and acknowledgement. Small gestures of respect, previously overlooked, became meaningful acts of connection. The receptionist remained at her desk, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. For the first time, she understood that authority without empathy is hollow, and judgment without understanding is destructive. Manny's presence had exposed not only her behavior, but the culture of dismissal and bias that had permeated the hotel. She could no longer hide behind the polished surface of her role. Daniel's eyes met Manny's one last time through the open doors. He mouthed a silent, "Thank you," which Manny returned with a subtle nod and a small smile. That nod was more than acknowledgement. It was validation, encouragement, and the passing of a lesson that would stay with Daniel for life. Think about your own life. Have you ever judged someone by their appearance or overlooked the value of quiet effort and integrity? Tell us where you're watching, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters. As the doors closed behind Manny, the lobby remained transformed. Guests whispered thoughtfully, staff straightened with a newfound respect, and Daniel stood taller than he had in years. The hotel, with all its grandeur and polish, had been reminded that true value lies not in wealth or status, but in the dignity we afford each other. And in that moment, one man had changed more than a single hotel. He had reminded everyone present that kindness, respect, and humility are the greatest legacies anyone can leave behind.